closing it, and it didn't seem to save the recording. I'm looking around to see if it's in the temp file somewhere, right? But that means for Monday there might not be a backup recording. But again, remember that, and I'm sorry, but remember that the whole point of the recordings is as backup and not as a primary avenue to access the material, right? It's there to, in case you look back at your notes and you miss something. So anyway, I'm sorry that didn't work. It's just sometimes the things crash, right? That happens with our digital lives, right? So we're going to continue talking about Baroque Holland. When I was where you were, my first art history class, I got like a C, right? Because I didn't study well. But beyond that, after I got done, I was a studio art major, and I was doing drawing and printmaking. And I took art history classes, and as I got to the advanced level, I started to do better because I figured out what I needed to do to succeed. Right? I couldn't just sit there. But Baroque Holland got me into art history, and the teacher that I had sort of recommended that I do something like this, right? And I really love this stuff, and I'm teaching it this semester at the advanced level as well. And it was really nice to sort of dive back into the stuff that I don't get a chance to teach that often in depth. And so I'm going to try and get through it as quick as I can because we're behind. But at the same time, part of me wants to linger here because I think this stuff is so great. It's so vibrant and it's so lively and it's so modern in so many ways, unlike a lot of what we've been looking at. It's our first period where we're looking at ostensibly non-religious works, right, for the most part. And also, it's the Protestantism we talked about, sort of what makes Holland special and unique in the Baroque period, right? They don't have a king, right? They're the one non-regency in Europe. They're Protestant rather than Catholic, which is leading to this war of independence that they're fighting during the period that we're looking at. Right? They're fighting for their independence from Spain. They have an extraordinarily democratic distribution of wealth. It's extraordinarily prosperous. And lots of people can buy art. And what we find is that it's the single most important art market in all of Europe at the time. And not only are there hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of painters working for this extraordinarily broad clientele, right? In most other European countries, it's the church, which does, the Protestant church isn't buying pictures because they believe in undecorated churches, right? So in other countries, it's the church and it's royalty or nobility. And Holland has a more classless society. They don't have lords and whatnot, right? They're merchants. And you make your lot in life. And so if you're a successful, flower vendor, then you can afford paintings too, Everybody's buying paintings. And this really has a great deal to do with how the Baroque plays out in Holland. Some elements are particularly Baroque, as we've been talking about. It can be fairly dramatic. It can be engaging of you, the viewer, right? These things we've seen has been typical of the Baroque period. Even though it's not Catholic, even though they're not religious pictures, they still make a point to reach out and sort of engage with you, make you a non-passive viewer. Gabrielle, were you raising your hand?
Yes. Before you said something about House of Orange.
The William of Orange, exactly right. So I had last time, in last class, I had mentioned that the War of Independence, the 80 Years' War, which breaks out in 1568, right, is really anti-Spanish, right? And this is what motivates it, right? It is the King of Spain is Catholic, right? And this would be, in 1568, it's Philip II, who's the grandfather of Velázquez's patron, right? We talked about Philip IV, okay? So when we looked at Velázquez and Spain and Philip IV, that's all taking place during the end of the 80 Years' War, okay? But the start of it, 1568, is Velázquez's patron, Velázquez's king's great-grandfather, Philip II of Spain, right? And he is Habsburg as well. And he's pretty dyed-in-the-wool Catholic, right? And he wants to take, and he's in power in the middle of he takes power in 1549, I think, right? So it's Reformation's going. Protestants are out there, right? And Protestantism is spreading. It's not taking over, but it's spreading. It's everywhere. And in most places, it's okay, right? We got both. It's all right. But Philip wants to make Catholicism the only religion in his realm, right? He outlaw the other ones. And that means that he wants to make Protestantism, in the green part of the map, Flanders, he wants to make Protestantism the official religion of Flanders as well. And what do you do if you're a Protestant who's living there? You leave, right? Or you fight, okay? So what we find is that the Protestants flee north, and the northern part, the yellow bit, was part of Philip's realm beginning in 1568, and they decide that we're going to fight for independence. We're sick of the Spanish, right? We don't want to be Catholic. We want to be... we're happy to have Catholics around, but we want to make sure that we can still practice Protestantism, right? So that rebellion begins after a huge set of riots in 1566. So 1568, there's this big start of and the leader of the military forces that are fighting for free Holland, right, or the United Provinces of the Netherlands, as they called themselves, was William of Orange, also known as William the Silent, right? And Orange was the name of his house, the House of Orange, okay? And he leads the initial part of this, but obviously he's not around for 80 years, right, for the entire thing. So his son, grandson, great-grandson become the governors of Holland, right? The term they use is stateholder or stadthouder in Dutch, right? They become the governors, and there seems to be this idea of passing power through the family, but it doesn't work like a kingship, right? They really are primarily military leaders. And the people who lead the different cities and the different provinces, the 7 united provinces, are democratically elected. And they meet together as a group. So it's sort of like our Congress, right? So Orange, however, and I think what's inspiring your question is this splash of orange that's up on the screen, right? Orange became the national color because of the House of Orange. And it was on their flag in the 17th century. There were 3 colors on the flag in the 17th. We'll see that in just a second, right? But to this day, the Dutch national soccer team, football team, right, wears orange. They're the Orangemen because of that, right? And there's a Dutch beer called Orange Tree. You can buy it at Trader Joe's, right? So it's an important color for them because of William of Orange, right? But he had nothing to do with oranges, right? Just that was the name of the family dynasty house that he came from. Okay? Long story, but it's an important one because it sets the stage for what we're talking about here, right? Okay. So during the early part of the 17th century, all the way until 1648, there is this ongoing fight against the Spanish. And it's pretty intense at first, right? And it's through most of the Low Countries, fighting the countryside, right? But as we move closer and closer to the end of the war, and Spain is getting weaker and weaker and weaker, and Holland's getting stronger and stronger and stronger, what we find is that the countryside becomes a little bit more safe, and the fighting gets pushed further and further to the south, right? So that there's a front line. Now, the fellow this is all important because the fellow that we see here is a member of the Civic Guard in the city of Haarlem. And Haarlem, for Amsterdam's here, right? Haarlem is right there. They're really just next door, right? And every city had a Civic Guard that was... primary duty was to protect the city. Remember Roger van der Weyden and the deposition from the cross that was made from the cross building? They were the Civic Guard of the city of Leuven, which is down in here. Right? I don't think it's on this map, but it's right, basically right in there. Yeah? They were the Civic Guard. So this guy's a Civic Guard member. We can tell because he's wearing his armor, right? But what's weird is that he's also wearing the armor not to battle, but just to show it off. Because the lace collar that he has that floats over the top of it, you would never wear in battle. And that coat that he has underneath it is not a battle coat. Right? These are ceremonial clothes. And then the sash is there to signify his rank. Right? So it's an odd picture in that he's in military garb. He's definitely a militiaman, but he's not. He's dressed to sort of show off rather than to march out to battle or anything, right? So he is a member of the militia of Haarlem, right? And early on, Haarlem was the front line. But by the 1630s, the front line had moved away from there, right? Now, in Holland, in this inflated market for paintings, right? This really expanded market for paintings, what we find, and we talked about this on Monday, is that artists specialized. They tried to carve out a niche of that market, right? And there were numerous kinds of paintings that people could collect, right? And most artists are working in a particular kind of painting, a particular type. So we'll have people who are specialists in landscape painting. And we'll have people who specialize in still life painting. And we'll have people who specialize in portrait painting. And the idea is that if you specialize, people will come directly to you when they've got a choice, right? Trying to think of a modern marketing thing. You know, it's like the old adage that you're not going to get really good pizza if you go to a Chinese restaurant, right? Because they don't specialize in pizza. You're going to get really good pizza if you go to a pizza restaurant. That's what they do, right? And people who try to be all things to all people are usually not very good at any of them, right? Applebee's, right? I have everything from burgers to pancakes to pizza. And it's like none of them are any good as you get an IHOP for pancakes or a real pizza place, right? Okay. Frans Hals is a portrait painter. That's his primary specialty, right? He's carving out a corner of the market. At the same time, and what makes him so good as a portrait painter is the ability to enliven the portrait. It's not, most portrait paintings for my money are pretty darned boring. The guy just sitting there, standing there. And Hals is still just sort of posing for us with his arm on his hip, like Charles I, right? That sort of aristocratic pose. But there's something about the way he treats the face that gives it an amazing sort of insight into personality and liveliness. They're engaging, right? And that's very, very Baroque. And the reason Hals was so good at this is that before he became a portrait painter, a specialist in portrait painting, he had been a specialist in genre painting. And a particular kind of genre painting, these close-ups of people engaging with usually food or music. Right? And if we think about that the people are posing with music, and they're not portraits, right? They're not meant to be an individual person. They're types, right? And they're engaging with music and food. You remember this Baroque idea that art is going to get to you by attracting your other senses. It's not just about looking, right? It's about smelling and tasting and hearing as well. And we've seen in Catholic art, in religious art, how artists will do that because of St. Ignatius Loyola, right? But painters, even in Holland, are very much interested in reaching out to you. And Hals's pictures do this. And I've just, like I said, I took a class to Amsterdam, right? And we went to Haarlem as well over spring break. And these are extraordinarily engaging pictures. One of my all-time favorite pictures is this one. He's a guy at a pub, right? And he's saying, hey, join me for a drink, right? And he's reaching out to you and handing that drink to you, and he's sort of happy to see you. And that same sense of sort of being happy to see you is something that Hals brings to his portraits as well. There's a sense that he's not just posing, but, hey, you're here. I know you're here, and I'm glad you're here. That's something that Hals is able to do with his portraits, which makes them so special. The other thing that makes him so vibrant and lively is Hals's approach to painting, the style, how he puts the paint on the canvas. It's not refined. It's not polished. It looks fresh. It looks sketchy, as if he sort of quickly laid down all of the colors. And this becomes obvious as we dive in more deeply. This is now the orange sash, right? And as you look at it closely, and we've seen this in other painters too, Velázquez, for example, right? But it's also true for Rubens. It's also true for Van Dyck, that in the Baroque period, we see a number of artists beginning to play with the idea of spontaneity, to make the painting look as if it was spontaneously conceived. momentarily conceived. And that adds to the sense of a momentary instance that the painter is captured with the painting. And Hals is as good as anybody in the 17th century for making the paint look spontaneous, making it look as if he just sort of dashed this out quickly. And it's all artificial, right? It's not the result of quick painting, but it is the result of an attempt to make it look momentary, right? In the same way that, with your camera, you want to take snapshots that capture the vibrancy and the liveliness of the moment, right? That's really what Hals is doing with paint in the 17th century. And everywhere we look, the paint is just extraordinarily open-ended, right? I don't know if you ever saw Titian. Titian was the one who began this thing, right? Or how he got here. But it's absolutely extraordinary, his handling of paint, and it adds to the vibrancy that his paintings have, right? This is part of the reason I think he was so successful as a portrait painter. There was a group that wanted this. Now, Hals was also the member of one of these militia guilds in Harlem, right? They were volunteers. They were like volunteer fire departments, right? All these guys had normal 9-to-5 jobs, but they also volunteered to be part of the militia guild and called up to service when needed, right? But it wasn't a full-time job. It wasn't like military service in the United States, right, where you would give up years of your life. And they were supported, the group was, by the city, and they had not annual, but semi-annual meetings that they would gather together, and they would elect the officers for the next term. Right? And they would have shooting contests and so forth, and the city would pay for their meals, right? And Frans Hals belonged to one of these militia companies. There are like 3 of them in the city of Harlem, and Hals was a member of one of them. We think that the one on the left might be a self-portrait, because the majority of his paintings of these guys are group portraits rather than individual portraits. And this is one of only 2 individual portraits that Frans Hals ever did of one of these groups. So why did these 2 guys so special? Right? We think that might be Hals, but there's no smoking gun. There's no proof. Right? On the right, we see the group gathered together for this meal that's funded by the city. This is good for them. This is their status, right? And again, the sense of momentary vibrancy, right? Instant, like we caught a particular moment, right? They're posed, but they don't look posed. They're busy in activity. And this idea of group portraits had been around for about 100 years, but Frans Hals is shaking it up. He's doing something drastically different. You've done your worksheet by now on Rembrandt's Night Watch, right? That was also a group portrait. Takes what Hals is doing a step further. Adds a little narrative to it, right? In this case, this is an event that would have happened, right? Now, originally, group portraits were pretty boring. Row of heads, enlivened maybe by some gestures that keep your eye moving through it, but on the long run, it's a bunch of guys who have been set up to look at you. And you can see that what Hals has done is to make this much more engaging. You can hear this picture. You can smell this picture. You can taste this picture. You can sense the conversation that's going on, right? And Hals puts front and center one of the guys looking directly out at us and saying, "Hey, he's the rude dude at the beer you ever go to a bar and there's some guy that's going, 'Hey, waitress, my glass is empty,' right? Rather than sort of being polite. That's what this guy's doing. But at the same time, he seems kind of fun about it as well. Tipping his glass upside down. They're eating oysters. It's a very expensive little meal, right? But it's engaging. He's looking directly at you, and he's almost as if you're part of this, right? You're the one he's talking to. He's not just looking at you. He's asking you to join in the group. The leader of the group is this guy in orange on the far left, holding his glass, which still has wine in it. And there's this sense of a sort of an enjoyable banter between the different figures here, a sense of conversation. And again, we can see, and I've got a nicer detail coming up, Hals's open brushwork that enlivens the entire scene. So here is the leader of the group, and he's engaged in this lively banter with his friends. He's got his hand on the hilt of his sword. That's the sort of symbol of him as a leader of that in the position. Each one of them wears a different color. These are the blue, white, and orange are the colors of the Dutch flag in the 17th century. Not anymore, right? But in the 17th century, these are the colors of the Dutch flag. You'll also notice that they have numbers on them. He's number 1. The fellow behind him is number 4, right? This is not only their rank within the company, but I think these things all had little guidebooks. And they were displayed in public so you knew who was who, right? I'm not going to bother you. At the opposite end, number 3, is a dwarf who was a member of the group, the entertainer. This is the Baroque, right? They love this sort of stuff. Remember the Las Meninas, Henrietta Maria down in the National Gallery, right? The idea of keeping dwarves around as entertainment. So here he is. He's been given a relatively lofty rank, I think, here. And each of the colors indicates not only rank, but sort of different parts of the company that they belong to, right? So that's all there and accurate. And again, it's enlivened not only by these gestures, the brushwork, the composition with all the diagonals that cut back and forth across it, right? Hals is doing something really extraordinary and special, and particularly Baroque with the way he handles the paint. I haven't had a chance to process the pictures I took when I was there. This is one of them, so we can see him much more close up, and also see the way in which this thing I've been talking about with Hals. Look at how the sleeve is handled, and then you get up close. The buttons on the sleeve break down from being buttons, these bits right here, right? And you can start to just see the quick flashes of paint, right? And the handling of the shine on his sleeve around the elbow is just this sort of sketchiness, right? That is that sense of momentary, and there's a sense of performance here almost, of the painter performing for you. That I think fits in with this Baroque interest in dramatization, right? It's a very different kind of dramatization than Rubens. It's a different kind of dramatization than Bernini or Caravaggio. But it's dramatization nonetheless, right? And the blue around his sleeve just becomes a sort of dance of paint, right? There's almost a celebration of paint as paint rather than... This is a complicated thing, right? So painting is 2 things. Did I go over this before? I might have. When we look at paintings, okay, or any artwork for that matter, we tend to think about it as a representation, and we tend to talk about, what is it? It's a bunch of guys at the table, okay, eating a meal. But there's another element. A painting is an object, right? A painting is a representation, but a painting is an object. The same thing holds true for a sculpture, right? Michelangelo's David is David, but it's a block of marble that's been carved, right? There's the physical attributes of this thing, right? That's a thing. It's an object. It's the creation of somebody working with natural materials, right? And Hals seems to understand both of these things at the same time, right? That there's parts of the painting that make you think of it as an object, rather than look at it as a subject. So you look at that sleeve or that ruff, and you understand it as a ruff, and you back away from it, right? And painting manuals said that the best way to appreciate paintings in the 17th century was to back away and then come close and then back away again, right? And as you back away, it's rough, it's sleeve, it's obvious. You come up close and it turns into paint. Abstract, almost, in the way you resonate. And that's what I think is extraordinary about this, and really particularly modern, particularly forward-looking. And we'll see it gets kind of lost for the next couple hundred years and picked up again in the 19th century. But Hals is extraordinary this way, and a number of artists in the 17th century are absolutely extraordinary this way. Also working in Haarlem is Judith Leister. And she paints in a style that's quite similar to Frans Hals. She's, the second female artist we've had a chance to look at, right? That's because women weren't allowed the same opportunities as men were when it came to art school, right? It was a patriarchal society, and women didn't have access to many of the things you needed access to become an artist. For example, working from a model. They weren't allowed, right? And we see so very few for exactly that reason. And the ones that we do see usually broke through because of other connections, right? Were able to break through. And I think this painting, the self-portrait in the National Gallery, is in many ways a sort of a statement of what it means to be a woman in a man's world. A woman artist practicing an art that is normally practiced by men. At the same time, it's infectious. It reaches out to you. It grabs you. She's the laughing painter. She enjoys her work, right? And she's caught immediately in the act of painting. We think it might have been made to present to the Painters Guild as her proof of mastery when she joined the Painters Guild in 1630. And she's really quite young. She's 20-ish when she paints this, right? And so we see her at the easel. We can see, if you look at the paint in the lower area, she's holding what must be about 24 brushes. I can't imagine you would need that many. But maybe that's what she's saying is, hey, I can do it all, you know? And her dress that comes out at the bottom is loosely painted a la Frans Hals, very similar to the way Hals paints. And in fact, for many, many years, not only was the art world driven by men, but the art history world was driven by men. And they thought, well, she paints like Hals, she must have slept with him. There's no proof for this, right? Oh, well, then we get a little bit more enlightened. We say, okay, you don't have to sleep with a guy to be a good painter. Or don't sleep with a painter to be good. She must have studied under him. No proof for that either, right? I think what it is Hals established a market for sort of loose brush work that she's working it in her own way, right? Well, terrific picture of her busily painting. And we see the painting on the easel. We see the paint on her palette. If you get up close to this picture, the paint on the palette looks like she took the tube and just sort of squeezed some paint right onto the palette. So it sits on the palette like the paint would have sat on the palette in reality. Right? It sits on the surface of the painting that way. And she's got that huge wad of brushes. I think it's too many for anybody to ever hold. And she's caught in the act of painting. And again, just like Frans Hals, she is so happy you're here. Right? You're part of this. The world that she lives in doesn't end with the frame. It's your world. And she addresses you, and you're part of this, right? And she couldn't be happier that you're here. And I think that's the thing with Dutch art that I find so wonderful, right, is that, and does that maybe come from the democracy we've been talking about, the widespread democracy, the idea that this is a classless society? Not entirely, but more classless than most other places, that these paintings engage with you, right? They democratize viewing. That might be part of it, but I think it's also very much part of the Baroque, right? This period dominated by an engaging, interactive kind of art, right? So she's busily painting, right? The picture that she's painting is a man playing a violin. And I think that this not only can we identify that picture, she painted 2 or 3 versions of this picture, of this violin player, right? So that's one of her pictures that she's shown painting. But it's also this funny thing because he's laughing too, right? Just like she is. So there's a parallelism between painting and music that she's drawing here. Both of them are entertainers in their way, right? She entertains through visuals, he entertains through sound. And there's that Baroque idea again of the different senses coming into play, right? But look at how she holds the brush. She's got her pinky out and she's got it between his fingers. And look at how he's holding the bow, right? There's again a visual parallel there between her hand and his hand. She is an artist, just as he is an artist. She's an entertainer, just like he's an entertainer. She's a woman, and he's a man, right? It's about her place within the world. And some people have suggested that if we think about the painting in 2 dimensions, what part of his anatomy has she been painting? Right? She's been painting his crotch. So that's not sexual or anything. She's just basically, hey, he's a man, I'm a woman, right? This is me making my art as he's making his art, and she's signaling the importance of gender within the 2 works, right? It's utterly fascinating that way as a statement. Now, as another statement, right, as a statement of her role as a woman artist. Right? I hate saying that because it makes it sound like if I don't put woman there, that means artist means man, right? But a statement of her role as a woman who paints. It's also a statement of something that we saw with Velázquez, which is that painting is not just a craft. Right? Painting is A noble profession. Look at how she's dressed. Now, oil paint dries very, very slowly, right? Over days, even weeks, depending on how thick you put it down, right? It takes forever to dry. She's dressed like an aristocrat. An extraordinary lace collar that she's wearing comes dangerously close to brushing against the wet canvas she's working on. This is not how any painter would dress, right? Today, you take an art class, you put on an apron, right, to keep it clean, but you still get, like, every time I go into the studio, I forget I'm wearing long sleeve shirts, and no matter how I bundle them up, I'll end up with dirt, grime from the charcoal or the etching ink or whatever ends up on my clothes. You would not wear your Sunday finest, right, if you're going to go painting, but she is. So in many ways, this is also a statement not only of her role as a woman who paints, but also a statement of what painting is as a craft. That it's not a craft. That it's a noble profession. Yeah. And we've seen other artists after the Renaissance really working with this idea, right? Art as a noble profession. We've got one of her pictures also downtown at the Women's Museum, the National Museum of Women in the Arts. And this is one of her many pictures of festive music makers. That seems to be her primary specialty, were scenes of everyday life, but particularly musicians. Not exclusively, but a lot of them. And in this case, this musical trio, that's her in the middle, right? Taking part in the music as well, right? So this all adds to the sort of persona of Judith Leister as this artist who entertains. That's what she does with her paintings anyway. They're very entertaining scenes about music making, about having fun, maybe sometimes about the limits of having fun, right? But she's participating in it, and she's enjoying it. And that makes these extraordinarily engaging, fetching pictures. Another artist who specializes is Jakob van Ruisdael. Does nothing but landscape paintings, right? And when we talk about landscape painting, if we had more time, you would find other artists who did cityscapes, only cityscapes. We have other artists who did only boating pictures, seascapes, right? And some artists will only do sort of villages in the countryside, because the art market is that big that it can handle all of these different specializations. So Jakob van Ruisdael does a significant number of landscape paintings. That's really all he does. And many of them are densely wooded like this, right? Where we see, as we look at the picture, the water coming down this river flowing toward us, taking a bend to the left, running under a bridge. There's a woman with a boy and a dog on the bridge, wandering off into the woods, sort of peacefully, right? Landscape paintings became the most popular kind of painting in all of Holland. It's been estimated up to 40% of all of the pictures that sold in the 17th century were landscape pictures. 40%, right? So what's that? 2 out of 5 pictures were landscapes. And they were the cheapest as well. Again, people have done a lot of studies on this stuff, right? Different kinds of painting cost different amounts, and landscapes were the cheapest, right? History pictures, historical scenes were the most expensive because they took the most talent. You had to paint a landscape. You had to paint the human figure. You had to paint costumes, right? You had to know the history. That made history paintings that much more expensive. But landscapes were affordable art, right? And visitors to Holland talk about the fact that there's hardly even a farmhouse that doesn't have a landscape picture in it. Everybody owns these things, right? And so we should ask ourselves, to begin with, why are they so darned popular? Why are landscape pictures so popular in Holland in the 17th century? Why do so many people own them? Why are they such a heavy seller? And there's a couple of easy answers to this, right? On the one hand, the country is newly independent, right? They're fighting for their independence, so national identity is on everybody's mind, right? We are Holland. We are different. We are independent. We are a new country. And when that's on people's minds, we find this in America in the 19th century, right? Monroe Doctrine, Manifest Destiny, right? America's growing from the 13 colonies and spreading westward through the 19th century. We find that the most popular kind of painting in America is landscapes, because the land is the country, right? The land is identity. And so people would buy these things because they evoked elements of the Dutch countryside. They evoked this new passion for nationalism, patriotism. So that's one of the reasons why landscapes are so popular in the 17th century. We add to that Dutch pride in their innovation. One of the things that the Dutch did through the course of the 17th century was to add land. In other words, well, back up. To make it clear, Holland in the 17th century was primarily watery. And you know that most of the country is below sea level. That's why we call it the Netherlands, the low countries, right? It's very, very, very flat. And through the course of the 17th century, what they're doing is they're reclaiming land from the ocean by putting up dikes and pumping the water out into the ocean, right? And that makes arable land where it was once underwater, okay? So Amsterdam is basically right here, yeah? And there was this huge inland lake that was drained during the 17th century, right? And all of the areas that you see that aren't sort of lying green were brought back from the ocean by putting up dikes and pumping the water away. How do they pump the water away? Windmills, right? Not only does a windmill turn a grinding stone, so you can grind your wheat, right? But it can also turn a, what do you call that? A screw gear that will pump the water out, right? So what they would do is they put up a dike, pump the water, put up another dike, pump the water, put up another dike, pump the water, right? And what turned out is that this entire area down here, which is extraordinarily densely populated now, was underwater. Most of the city of Amsterdam was originally underwater, right? And was reclaimed from the ocean. So it's an extraordinarily innovative technology that they're doing. And so at the same time that they're becoming a political entity, separate from Spain, at the exact same time that's happening, they're also becoming a bigger country by reclaiming land from the sea. So for the Dutch, with this new identity, this new independence, land is crucial for them. Pride, right? It's who we are. It's what we excel in. It's not only politics. It's our crafty nature, right? This is what we've done, right? So about a third of the country, right, over the course of this period was reclaimed back from the ocean, and this for them was a great point of pride. So these things begin to account for why landscapes are so extraordinarily popular, right? Another thing that we can talk about in the growing popularity of landscaping, especially by Van Ruysdael's time, is that as the war wound on, right, the 80 Years' War ends in 1648. This is after it's over. But even in the last 2 decades of the war, the countryside became increasingly safe. It used to be at the early part of the 17th century that wandering in the countryside, you're taking your life in your hands. There's soldiers out there, right? There was a war going on. But as the front pushes further and further away from Amsterdam and Haarlem, right, the countryside around there becomes increasingly safe. And what we find is that people are out there and writing poems about the land, about how wonderful it is to wander through the countryside, right? Look at what the Dutch have done. Look at the technology and what it's revealed for us. And we find that the rise of landscape sort of coincides with the increasing safety of the countryside. I lost the train of thought. There was something else I was going to say. One of the things that those poems talk about when they talk about wandering through the countryside is that when you wander through the countryside, you should think about life and realize that A walk in the woods is a metaphor for your journey through life. That as you walk to see something wonderful, you should think about your life as a trek to something wonderful. Right? And that you should see parallels between these things, and you should use your time to reflect on your life, right? And so one wonders when we look at these if this idea of the metaphor of traveling through life maybe is in the paintings as well. Are there clues here? Right? So if we read the picture and we look at it, what we see is a figure crossing a bridge. That's a potent metaphor, isn't it? I've crossed the bridge. When we say that, what do we mean? We mean I've moved to the next phase of my life, right? I've crossed that bridge. I'm done with that. I'm now moving on to this, right? So a figure crossing a bridge may well just be a mundane image of a woman coming back from a market. She's got her little wicker basket, a little boy with her, and a puppy dog, right? It may just be nothing but just reflecting reality. But at the same time, it may have metaphoric content. She's crossing the bridge. And if we think about that idea of crossing the bridge, right, and the idea of a metaphor of wandering through life, if we look at the picture more closely, what we see is that there's things on that path. She's about ready to climb the path. She goes across the bridge. The path goes up into the woods and kind of disappears into the darkness. But if we look closely enough, there's somebody coming toward her. A dark figure, shadowy figure, right? Walking down the path toward her. And as we think about these poems that talk about wandering through the countryside as a metaphor for life, it's still not without its dangers. It's still not without its worries. And the painters seem to include these things to give us the possibility of looking at the picture, and as we maintain interest in it, adding narrative to it, participating in it, bringing something to it, and saying, okay, I'm going to put these elements together and tell a story, right? And what we find when we read about people who write about pictures in the 17th century, that's what they said. That's how they appreciated pictures. They would go to them and they would develop stories from the visual clues that the painters would add. So, on a certain level, this painting is about going through life, right? Passing through time as you pass through space, right? Three-dimensional space. And with that in mind, we look at the rest of the picture. Lower right corner, fallen tree, waterfall. Are there any waterfalls in Holland? I will tell you no, right? Maybe on the German border, you might get some, right? But it is flat as flat can be, and so much of it's below sea level already. So what we have is the inclusion of this sort of imaginary waterfall. Why does he put it there? What are waterfalls evocative of? Well, certainly erosion, the passing of time. The river cuts its way through the path, right? It can erode solid objects like rocks eventually. And that idea of the passage of time is picked up by the broken birch tree branch. It's laying next to it, right? Time has passed. The tree has fallen. If we look at the trees that are on the hill, you'll notice that there are three of them, right? Three prominent ones. If we read from right to left, the one on the farthest right is in full leaf. It's healthy. The one in the middle is partly healthy. Some of the branches are broken, but some of them still are leafy. And the one on the left is dying. Right? The bark is peeling off. So if we think about that as the sort of elements of life, right? Health and decay are themes that Van Rousdale is bringing into the landscape. Right? It's full of potential metaphor. Right? And then we can add into it something else. 3 trees on the bluff of a hill. Any guesses there? What that might be all about? Say it louder. The crucifixion, Jesus between 2 thieves. 3 trees erected on a hill, right? And when we read the poems that were written in the 17th century about walking through the landscape, reflecting on life and its own journey, right? one of the things that they say is you should see the hand of God in all of his creation, right? And they should remind us of various elements of biblical history, even as we're not looking at it. So it's a sort of veiled reference to that same idea. But it doesn't work out exactly, right? Because if that were the case, you would say the live tree should be in the middle, because that would be Jesus. That's not the case here, right? But still, there are these overlaying references that one could read into the landscape pictures. So these Dutch pictures, right? And remember that this is the area that Jan van Eyck came from. All of that disguised symbolism we saw with Jan van Eyck, right? Hundreds of years earlier, 200 years earlier. Well, that legacy of sort of veiling images with, or using images to veil meanings is something that's really quite strong in the 17th century as well. One last thing, I picked up the train of thought that I had lost. Another reason these are so extraordinarily popular, right? We talked about land reclamation. We talked about increasing safety of country travel, right? We talked about patriotism and the new political entity, okay? The other thing that we can add to that is that Holland was and remains to this day the most densely populated part of Europe, particularly that land that was reclaimed from the sea. That whole seaboard area is right now the most densely populated part of all of Europe, right? And was also in the 17th century, right? Most people live existences that are urban, they're landlocked, right? So landscape pictures as a thriving genre of pictures makes sense in an urban environment. They allow you the opportunity to join this woman on her path and imagine yourself moving off to the countryside, be entertained by the world outside as you're stuck in the city, right? That adds to their popularity as well. Other specialists in Holland, remember artists are all specializing, another specialty of paintings is still life painting, right? That's a term we use today. They used all sorts of different terms for these. They didn't call them still life. The term comes from stilled life, things that aren't moving, right? Things that could or once moved or whatnot. Things are set up, right? And the Dutch never used that word. They would call this a banquet piece, right? But there are various specialties of still life painting. And Willem Hede does nothing but banquet and food pieces, food still lifes. Whereas other artists might do flowers or dead animals, which you might want if you had a hunting lodge, right? Trying to think of other kinds. Fruit still lives, right? Many with insects in them. But Hede gives us a lot of these images of the aftermath of a meal, right? And it's a very, very fine meal. It's not just any meal, but this is an extraordinarily expensive and celebratory meal, right? This is to celebrate a holiday. And we know that by the things that are on the table. Because if we look at the different things that we can see, right, we see a pewter jug with the lid open. We see a gold goblet with a sculpture on top. We see a silver dish called a taza, T-A-Z-Z-A. A huge goblet next to it. All this plate with pies and buns and whatnot. That beautiful, swirly vinegar pitcher in the background. These are expensive things. For this meal, they have brought out their finest. And then the stuff that's on the table is also equally expensive. Right? The food stuff is itself expensive. So this is the aftermath of a very, very expensive meal. And they've sort of bunched up part of the table covering. The white cloth has been put out to cover the more expensive felt tablecloth, right? For the meal, so in case you spill, right? You can clean it more easily by bleaching it, right? And the artist has sort of included these different elements. And when he makes different still life paintings, you sometimes see the exact same things reappear in other pictures, but he changes the scale of them because he's invented, right? It's not a photograph. Okay? So these are extraordinarily expensive stuff. Here's a nice detail. And again, this one also, I think, reaches out to you. Look at the knife handle coming toward you as if to say, have a bun, right? Have a dinner roll. But we also see reflections. And it's as if our world is part of this world. The windows that are behind us are reflected in the picture on that goblet that's been upended or on the side of the pewter jug. In one or two of these, we'll see reflections of the artist back there painting, right, at his easel in the glass. Not here, but in others as well. So we have this gold goblet, this pewter jug with a few dents in it. On top of the goblet, there's a little figure of King Neptune, the god of the sea, which of course for the Dutch is key, right? They're the gods of the sea. They rule. That's how they beat Spain, right? Dutch East India corporations from this exact same time. The ocean is extraordinarily important to them. So Neptune there has resonance for our viewers. The food stuff that's here is equally ornate. It's a mincemeat pie. And mincemeat pies are they're extraordinarily deeply flavored. They got like clove and allspice, and they're really like rich, right? Like baklava or Turkish delight. They just have the nutty, rich, deep, sweet sour flavor, right? They're really good, but they're so rich that you can't eat a lot of it, right? And they're only ever served, because they're difficult to make, they're only ever served at festive holiday meals, right? So the mince pie also adds to the luxury of this meal. We have I imagine a beer glass back there. The tall cylinder has salt on top of it, right? If we look around the rest of it, we see oysters, right? Can't eat too many of those either, right? Again, really, a good oyster has a really strong ocean flavor. It's hard to get them here. Really good oysters. But look on the left-hand side, and you see that we got lemons. Lemons don't grow in Holland. Lemons are imported. We get them now, what? 3 for $1, right? Because we can do that, right? Oranges and lemons, even though they don't grow near here. But for Holland, these are extraordinarily expensive things. Remember the oranges in the Arnolfini, right? Giovanni Arnolfini by Jan van Eyck. Those are oranges, symbol of wealth, right? So these are expensive, but they're also pungent, right? Really strong flavors. It's appealing to our senses. And what's on the dish behind the olive? First we have the oyster shells, right? But what are the other things there? Or behind, I said it already, didn't I? I meant to say behind the lemon. Olives, right? On the table back here. Again, imported delicacies, right? Now, why does he choose the things he chooses? This is an interesting question for us, right? There's a couple of things that are worthwhile noting here. One, it's a mess, right? The aftermath of this meal is messy. And two, they didn't eat everything. Okay, so these are two really important sort of elements of this, is that it's messy and it's not finished. Did he choose that for a reason? Is that meant to sort of signify something? Could we look beneath the surface of a still life and find meaning in the way that we might with that landscape painting or other pictures that we've looked at? Each one at a time. So it's messy. One thing we think is it actually has a message to do about diligence, about care. And if you look at the picture long enough, you realize that this is an uncared for table. So it could be like our older genre scenes where we see how not to behave. An image that shows us the lack of diligent care. So in this case, the tablecloth has been bunched up and pushed off to the right. And this dish is laying now right on the table with the oyster and the lemon and an olive there. And that's the table you're supposed to be protecting with that white cloth. But we've got an oily olive laying directly on it. You know, heck with that now. Try to get olive oil out of anything. My wife and I always joke that whenever we buy new clothes, we just soak them in olive oil to start with. And then they'll never stain because they're already covered in olive oil, right? But it's an oil stain is an impossible thing to get out. We also have the oyster laying directly on it, right? And then in the background, right behind it, look at how they've stacked those two dishes, right? With that expensive glassware, in a place where it could easily tumble off. So is there something here about a lack of diligence? Now that is a theme we find in other Dutch pictures. Very obvious. We see images of daily life where we see sleeping maids neglecting their duties. So this is not an extraordinary theme. It's something we find elsewhere, right? A lack of diligence. Look at how this plate is right, two of the foreground plates are right on the edge, right? As if in danger of toppling off of that table. And on this one, the little funnel was for pepper. That's how they serve pepper. You shake it out of the funnel. Again, imported spice, right? Expensive. Salt in the background. But the broken glass on the table, on the tray, as another sign of a lack of diligence, a lack of care for fine things. Right? So there might be a sort of moralizing underscore to this picture about a lesson of taking good care of expensive things. The dents in the pewter jug might tie into that as well. The other issue when we look at these is that idea of the unfinished meal. And for that, and this is a very common reading for these things, is that it's an image about restraint. That overlying this idea of diligence and neglect is also the idea of indulgence versus restraint. That you haven't, when I was growing up, I always said clean your plate, right? But cleaning your plate could be seen as gluttony as well. And not finishing every bite, not licking the plate when you're done, can be seen as showing a sort of modicum of restraint, right? Holding back. And this fits with their identity because the Dutch were primarily Protestant. There were some Catholics, they tolerated them, but they were Calvinists. And the Calvinists were very adamant about not overindulging. This is why when we look at Dutch portraits, they're almost always wearing black with those lace collars. Because they're not supposed to show off wealth in public. Houses had relatively restrained facades compared to other countries, right? The Calvinists, they were Remonstrants as well. Remonstrants were very tolerant of other religions, right? These two things together gave the Dutch a sense, which kind of to this day, they're tolerant to this day, right? Prostitution is legal, drugs are legal, up to a point, right? Soft drugs are legal. That comes out of this, but don't overdo it on the street, right? They hate the British tourists who come and ogle the prostitutes and puke and pee in public, right? That's over the top. That's overindulgent, right? Practice restraint. And the unfinished meal ties into this ideology of the period, right? The way people approach their lives. And what they would tell you if you read 17th century literature, why practice restraint? Why not eat everything? Well, there's more to life than pleasing your physical desires. That one should reflect on deeper things. Think about your soul as well as your body. And that if all you do is satisfy your body, then you're neglecting an aspect of your character. Life is short. You don't know when you're going to die. So make sure that at all times you practice restraint. Right? Because death could be at your door. And if we think about that element of why we practice restraint and we look at the picture, we realize there's all of these references to the brevity of life, to the precariousness of life. The dishes on the edge, which we talked about as being a symbol of lack of diligence, could also be the symbol of the frailty of life. You never know when you're going to fall. The broken glass next to the full glass, frailty of existence. The snuffed candle, the end of life. Right? All of these things begin to tie into another message with this picture about the possibility to participate, but the risks of doing so. And indeed, it seems to invite us. There's a handle coming directly out toward us. The thing that protrudes closest to us in the picture is something that invites us to pick it up, cut a piece of bread, have one of those oysters that's left over, an olive, or a little squeeze of lemon, right? Maybe a piece of pie. Enjoy it, but remember that that enjoyment might come at a price, right? Practice restraint. So there seems to be an underlying, underscoring image with this. The last specialist that we'll look at is Vermeer. And Vermeer is one of the most popular of the Dutch painters of the 17th century. I quite love him. And when I talked about getting into this whole idea of being an art historian, it was Vermeer that got me started. I just think he's terrific, right? And he specializes in genre scenes. We've talked about genre scenes before. Remember this, scenes of everyday life, right? But he specializes a little bit more than that. That a vast majority of his pictures, not all of them, but a good number of his pictures, are solitary women caught in a moment of self-reflection, doing sort of some everyday activity. They are usually the upper middle class lady of the house, in the middle of some small, mundane, everyday activity, reading a letter from whom we don't know. Husband on travels, right? Sick aunt, right? There's a map of Holland behind her that suggests travel. That might give us some context for the letter, right? The woman on the left, weighing her jewels, right? Figuring out the value of her jewels. But you'll notice as you look at the both of them that the composition is kind of the same, isn't it? In broad strokes. You have a window on the upper left that streams the light in softly. Not really Caravaggio, it's a little too soft for that, right? A table below it, lower left corner. The woman then in the middle, and something square on the wall behind her, right? There's a similarity to the compositions here. Here's another one from New York, just up the street a bit, if you will. It's very similar composition, right? The woman in a similar costume, slightly different here. At the window, now we see the window, the map on the wall that we saw in the other picture. The table's been moved to the other side, but no question that these are by the same artist, right? So Vermeer is a specialist, right, in this particular kind of scene. And using the same kind of composition again and again allows him to produce them more easily, right? And there seems to have been a market for these different kinds of envisionings of women caught alone at a moment of sort of privacy. And I've always found that the most fascinating thing about Vermeer is that sense that you've invaded their privacy, right? That they're doing something, they don't know you're there. So many Dutch pictures have reached out to us and grabbed us and asked us to join them and acknowledge our presence. But Vermeer's tend not to. They tend to have a quiet and a peacefulness that's absolutely extraordinary. Right? Now, if we look at the one on the left, which is what we'll focus on in depth, as I said, she's weighing her jewels, right? So she's got on the table, her jewel box is open, the tablecloth has been pushed off to the side, that heavy, nappy tablecloth has been bunched up in the shadow there. She's got her jewels all arranged. She's got the weights to go in the pan of the scale on the table next to her, right? But if we look really closely, the scale's empty. Now, there's nothing in the scale yet. She's not weighing anything. Right? She's looking down at the scale. So what she's done is she's pulled the scale out of its box, and I'm pretty sure that this is the scale box here. Right? And she's holding it for a second, and what's she doing? She's making sure that the scale is accurate, right? So because when you pick it up, it's going to do this, right? And she's waiting for it to settle down, and to see if one of the pans is heavier than the other. She's making sure that the scale is accurate. So the thing that she's going to use to gauge the value of her good, she's making sure it's going to give an accurate reading. Right? And that's kind of an important moment. If you put pearls in it, it means something different. Or it starts to nuance the meaning in a different direction. And if we think back to Quentin Matsys, right? He has actually got stuff in his scale, right? He's weighing the value of things. Vermeer's woman is taking a moment before she does that, right? He could have shown it this direction. There's a tradition for this, but he chooses something different. She's taking a moment beforehand to see if our values are in balance. And it nuances the meaning. And one of the things that Vermeer is really, really good at is ambiguity, where you get the sense that it means something, but you can't put your finger on it. That it might mean something very different to me and Kadisha because of what we bring to it and how we interpret it, right? At this point, she's looking down quite lovingly, right, at that scale. Is she taking a moment to figure out whether or not she should do this? Whether or not this is really worth it, you know? Whether or not it matters how much her pearls weigh or her gold weighs, right? Whether or not it matters how valuable her possessions are. Or is she making sure that she's going to know for sure? And it's ambiguous, right? He doesn't tell us exactly how to interpret the picture. But it certainly is this idea that she is taking a moment to ponder, to wait. And he then nuances this meaning by the inclusion of the other elements. That thing on the wall is a mirror. We know because the Dutch didn't put pictures behind glass like we do in museums now. So the reflectivity that comes off of it, that you can see inside the frame, suggests that there's a mirror there. There was a mirror in the Matsys as well. It was pointed at us. This was pointed at her. But she's not looking at it, right? So again, ambiguous meaning. Should she be looking at it? Reflecting on her own values? Whether or not they are in balance? Rather than focusing on worldly possessions? Right? Should she self-reflect instead? That's one possible way of reading it. Or is she not concerned with the vanity of the world? That she's not looking at her outward appearance, because that's all mirrors show us, is our outward appearance. Is she instead got everything in order? Not concerned with the values of this world, which would add to the fact that maybe she's going to put that scale back away. Right? Vermeer is the master of ambiguity, and we know this from technical studies, from x-rays and whatnot, that as he works in many of his paintings, there'll be something very obvious that triggers our interpretation one particular way, and he'll paint it out, right? He'll think about it first, and then he'll make it more ambiguous in the end, right? One of the things that is not ambiguous about this is the painting on the wall behind her head. And you can see that where the map was in those other pictures is now a framed picture. This picture is a Last Judgment, like Michelangelo's, right? Where Christ appears at the end of time to separate the good from the bad, the saved from the damned, right? And on his right side are the saved that are rising to heaven, and on his left side are the damned that are being cast into hell. And her head is right below him. He's judging as well, right? He's differentiating like a scale. We can't identify the exact picture, but we can identify the painter, right? It's that accurate. We think it might have been in Vermeer's collection. Vermeer was a Catholic, right? His wife was Catholic. He was one of the tolerated Catholics in Protestant Holland. And he owned quite a few pictures, many of which had Catholic themes. So here, Jacob de Bakker is his name, not that that really matters. But it's from around 1580 or so, the painting. 1580, 1590, so it's an old picture. at the time that Vermeer paints this. And her head is directly beneath where Christ would be. And in Last Judgment pictures, the place, that position, where Christ would be, is usually Michael with scales weighing souls. And that's where she is. She becomes sort of, how does, an embodiment of Michael in the real world. Right? So her scales replace his scales. And it adds to this idea of just evaluation, right? Proper evaluation of good versus bad. And maybe we should think about her as her own life is in the scales at this particular moment. So Vermeer nuances this meaning with all sorts of elements that give us the opportunity to push our interpretation of it in one direction or another. Right? And he's really terrific that way in these genre scenes. So what we've seen with all of the Dutch art that we've looked at, right, is that, one, they're extraordinarily interested in the elements of their everyday life, right? Still lives, portraits, genre scenes, landscapes, right? These are all just sort of the world around them fascinates them, and they paint it with extraordinary realism, right? At the same time, within that, they're looking at the world around them, and they're thinking about what it means. And they bring into the paintings this idea that there's more than just describing, right, in detail, in extraordinary realism, the world around you. But as we look at it and as we ponder it, that world is meaningful, right? Yeah.
What does Michael do?
Michael is the angel, the archangel, and he's the angel of judgment, right? Whereas Raphael is the angel of peace, right? So Raphael is the angel at the Annunciation. Michael is the angel of archangel at the Last Judgment. Yeah. So that's kind of Dutch art in a nutshell. What we haven't done is look at Rembrandt yet, right? Because in this period is one of the 2 or 3 most famous artists of all time, right? Rembrandt is Dutch Baroque art, right? But he stands apart from the rest of them in a lot of different ways. And so I'm not going to try and start him with a minute left in class. So we'll look at Rembrandt on Monday when we meet next, and we'll move from there to sort of start to move into the 18th century from there, right? So we're making pretty good time. I think we got plenty of time to get to make quite a bit of headway toward the modern era, right? So we'll pick up Rembrandt on Monday, the next day that we meet.